Welcome to the Fear and Courage podcast, where we tell stories of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and first responders. These careers are intense and in many ways foreign to the majority of people. We tell stories with intensity, dramatic personal impact, high physical and emotional stress, and lives changed as a result of the career service. Thanks for listening. Today, for the first time on the show, we have a married couple, Sam and Ann Matta. Sam received his commission in 2004 into the U.S. Army. He was commissioned into the Georgia National Guard as a second lieutenant, where he served while finishing nursing school. After finishing nursing school, Sam entered active duty, where he served just over 4 years, including a 15-month deployment to Baghdad, Iraq, with a combat support hospital. After leaving active duty in 2010, he began working as a flight nurse in Baltimore, Maryland. Ann Matta received her commission in 2005 after finishing nursing school. She served on active duty for just over 5 years, including that same 15-month deployment to Baghdad, Iraq, with a combat support hospital. After leaving active duty in 2010, Ann went back to school, where she became an acute care nurse practitioner. Today, she works as a nurse practitioner on a critical care resuscitation unit in Baltimore, Maryland. Ann joins us about 60% of the way through the podcast. Welcome to the show. On each episode of the podcast, we highlight a nonprofit organization that serves the military, law enforcement officer, or first responder communities. Today, we're going to highlight Camp Corral. Camp Corral is a free, one-of-a-kind summer camp for children of wounded, injured, ill, or fallen military service members. Since its founding in 2011 as a one-camp pilot program, Camp Corral has grown over 750%. Over 17,000 children have been served, and the program's expanded to 23 camps in 19 states. Although any child from a military family is eligible, registration priority is given to the children of wounded, injured, ill, or fallen service members. The camp's an incredible experience for these kids. What it does is it allows children with a similar experience that have possibly been through a traumatic event to create a sense of community and connect with other kids that have had similar experiences. That's an amazing opportunity, and it's something that kids of military families don't get, is a lot of exposure to a lot of other kids from military families. And this is the kind of experience that gives them that opportunity. If you want to get involved or donate, you can check them out at Camp Corral, CampCorral.org. campcorral.org. They've got a donate button. You can get involved. You can volunteer at one of the camps. If you know of a camp or are involved in a summer camp already, you can apply and become a Camp Corral host camp as well. So check them out at campcorral.org. You went to high school in Georgia, and then where did you go to school from there?
So, yeah, I went to high school in Georgia, moved my senior year because my dad was an active duty Army officer, and then went to Georgia Military College in Georgia, in Milledgeville, Georgia. The way I've described it to people before is West Point light. It was similar to, I guess, Texas A&M or the Citadel or VMI in that it was a normal college, but there was a Corps of Cadets. And if you lived on campus, you were part of the Corps of Cadets. But it was also just it was a community college. So it was just a 2-year school. And the interesting part about that is they are one of, I think, 2 or 3 places in the country that have kind of an accelerated ROTC curriculum. So you go to, the best way I have to describe it is an Army summer camp, the ROTC basic camp, and you go do Army-ish things, and you live in basic training barracks, but the drill sergeants can't yell at you because you're a college student and they have to be nice to you, which is kind of excruciating for them, but that clips your first 2 years of ROTC. So ROTC is usually a 4-year curriculum, 100 through 400, and it clips 100 and 200 year. And anybody can do that, but this was kind of a unique situation. I did it a month after graduating high school, 2 months after graduating high school. I went off to that and then spent 2 years at Georgia Military, kind of doing an associate's degree for pre-nursing. Got commissioned after my sophomore year, and then was a Georgia Guard officer for 2 years while I finished up nursing, the last 2 years of nursing school, kind of the nursing focused classes.
Okay, so and the way that 2-year commissioning program works is you're a second lieutenant upon graduating and receiving your associate's degree, and
Yes.
then
You have
do you
3 years to
gain
get your bachelor's.
okay, and so do you gain time in grade while you're getting your bachelor's, or do you sit in kind of a stagnant position?
No, you actually gain, you would gain time in service, time in grade. I actually got promoted to first lieutenant in the Georgia Guard. And then because I was going on active duty, and then also because I was going on active duty, more importantly, because I was going as a nurse. And the nurse corps is a specialty corps. So physicians, nurses, chaplains, and I think some of the medical specialty corps, the PAs, the physical therapists, things like
Dentists
that,
and things, yeah.
they cut your time in grade in half. So I was actually demoted. I actually had Fed Rec orders promoting me to first lieutenant, and the branch manager put it into the algorithm, and I went from having 2 years and 2 months in grade to a year and a month. When I went on active duty.
Okay, so active duty kind of discounts that time in school.
It's not that active duty discounts it, because I know guys who were infantry officers that kept their entire time in grade. It was because I went into the nurse corps. It was because I went to a specialty corps.
Gotcha. And so after you graduated from nursing school and you're a registered nurse and you immediately moved to active duty, kind of got bumped back a little bit in time and grade.
Yes. Yep.
And back down to second lieutenant, right?
Back down to second lieutenant. So yeah, I went to the officer basic course in San Antonio as a second lieutenant, and then graduated there. Was stationed in El Paso, Texas, at Fort Bliss, and about 6 months after I got there, I put first lieutenant back on technically, but I got promoted to first lieutenant because I had the year and a month or whatever when I came on active duty. So it only took another 6 months or so for me to put first lieutenant back on.
Okay. So what is a nurse on active duty, in the Army, for all intents and purposes, recently commissioned and recently starting active duty? What did the job look like?
So I was a med-surg nurse. So I worked on a standard med-surg floor, and that was a little bit painful for me because I had a fair amount of emergency medicine, like emergency medical services experience prior to. So during school, I did a lot of EMS, and then I worked in an emergency room pretty much all through nursing school as a tech. So I had a fair amount of emergency medicine experience, and it's just kind of as a policy across the board, they take all new nurses and they put them on a med-surg floor. So
what kind of floor is that?
Medical surgical, trying to describe. So you've got essentially 3 levels of like acuity of care, ICU being the highest level, and then there's usually an intermediate. Some places call them intermediate care units. Some places call them step down units. And then there's the lowest level. If you're admitted to the hospital, the lowest level is a floor bed. So I took care of a lot of patients that were there for like post-knee replacements, that you stay in the hospital for a day or so and get pain medication. And you're there for IV antibiotics, and that's it. Like, you can walk around, you're not super sick.
Orthopedic surgery is also pretty common in the Army.
Yes, orthopedic surgery is extremely common in the Army, and I was there during our first couple years, or our first couple years in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I took care of a lot of guys that were from Fort Bliss that had been kind of repatriated, if you will, back to their home station hospital. So guys with war injuries that weren't super sick but needed to be in the hospital. There was one guy that I know got in an IED explosion and had broken his femur and had what's called an external fixator on, which is like a big metal cage around his femur. And so guys like that, and
totally stabilized patients on the road to recovery.
Stable. These guys they're just there. Most of them were there. A lot of my patients were there for pain control or antibiotics, that like IV antibiotics that you can't get at home. pretty stable patients.
Okay.
The scary thing about some of those floors, though, is because it's brand new nurses and it's a pretty high patient to nurse ratio. They sometimes, a lot of times, the nurses don't realize how sick those patients are. So they can be a little bit not scary. They can be just not the.
It can get a little dicey sometimes.
It can get a little dicey, yeah, because you can get sick and nobody realizes it because you've got one nurse covering 7 patients and a tech that maybe sees the patient every 4 hours or something like that.
Okay, so and you did that job until
I did that job for about a year.
Okay, and until that first deployment.
I basically walked into my first assignment, and for better or worse, didn't really have that like fear of the 06 that a lot of people have, and maybe that's because I grew up in the military. But I basically said to my chief nurse, the 06 head nurse of the hospital, I want to go on the next deployment, because when I joined the military and based on my kind of prior experience with emergency medicine, that was my reason for going. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it. I want to go deploy. So there was a kind of another standard operating procedure that you had to be, they weren't going to deploy you less than a year. You had to be on active duty for more than a year before they would deploy you. So literally almost a year to the day, I deployed.
And that fear of the 06, going back a second, is an interesting thing in the military, because senior officers have such an aura about them. Colonels and generals will generally have some personal staff that accompanies them to certain things, especially big meetings. And so these people they have an extremely busy schedule. They're difficult to get on their schedule if you want to have a one-on-one conversation. They generally have an entourage, and that can create some hesitation or some trepidation on the part of subordinates, especially young lieutenants, in interfacing directly with an 06, which pay grade for a colonel or higher.
Exactly, and like you said, there's usually an entourage, and there's usually somebody who's basically assigned to keep me as the new lieutenant away from them and be their buffer. Particularly a general that may have like an aide de camp or something. Like his job is basically to filter the stuff that makes it to the general. And so I was lucky enough to kind of bypass that and actually get a meeting with her. And it was kind of her procedure to meet with all the new nurses that were coming into the hospital. So it wasn't a real hard thing for me to do, but
there's a little bit of FaceTime built in there.
It is, but you figure most of the other nurses I knew, most of the other new lieutenants, went in and just kind of sat there and answered whatever questions she had very briefly, and like didn't ask for anything.
Yeah, coming straight out with an ask in an early meeting is a bold move for a lieutenant speaking to their senior supervisor.
Yeah, and maybe it's because I grew up in the military, or maybe it's just because maybe it's just my personality. But I mean, I asked very respectfully, and like I did it in the right way, I feel like. But that's what I wanted to do. So I asked to go on the next deployment, and she granted that. Actually, she didn't give me the next one that was going out the door, and I'm actually really happy about that because it was a prison mission. That there were actual hospitals, combat support hospitals, that were assigned to Camp Cropper and like Abu Ghraib, and that's just not a mission that I wouldn't have felt fulfilled, I guess it would be the best way to describe what I would think that was like. And I've talked to people, I knew people who ended up on those missions. It's just a tough job, and you're taking care of detainees all the time.
Your primary job is care for the enemy, which if you think of just that description in and of itself, care for the enemy, that's a very strange and conflicted situation to be in. I don't think that, most people realize that with the Geneva Conventions in place and the law of war and just the way that the United States decides to conduct itself in a conflict, that the care the enemy receives the moment they are no longer a threat or an enemy combatant technically on the battlefield, the care that the enemy receives is pretty first rate.
Oh, it is.
And these are American doctors, American nurses, and
Yep.
American level and quality of equipment. And so they receive absolute first rate care from the moment they're injured on the battlefield all the way through to, through detainment, through recovery, whatever it is. And those people in those positions caring for them do a job that comes with some inherent confliction.
Absolutely. And I took care of a lot of detainees while I was deployed, because we were kind of the emergency room for, I guess, M&F Central. Like, all of the center of Iraq, everybody came to us, whether it be via Black Hawk or guys driving them in from the city of Baghdad. I remember 3 or 4 folks, like, guy jumped out of a second-story window, the bad guy that they were chasing, he jumped out of a second-story window and broke both of his feet. Literally, his feet looked like they exploded on CT, because he was trying to run from the soldiers that were raiding his house, and he jumped out of a second-story building, or a second-story window, and they brought him in, and he spent a day or 2 with us, and then I was told he spent upwards of 6 months getting pain control and getting taken care of, just like if a U.S. soldier had done that. He was just taken care of at a detainee facility. And you're right, it's 100% first-rate care, and we treated them absolutely no differently than the U.S. guys. I'll be honest with you, there was a little bit of an emotional difference. Like, it hurt more and it affected me more when I would see a U.S. soldier get hurt or pass away with us. But the care, the aggressiveness of the care and the level of care provided was exactly the same, whether it was a U.S. soldier in one bed and the guy that shot him in the next bed. It was an interesting dynamic. It absolutely was.
I imagine that the outward verbal, I would imagine that the outward verbal compassion and empathy is a little bit limited, but that doesn't affect the action, the quality of care, and the result, I don't believe, when it comes to care of insurgents. One example from my second deployment, I believe, a standard engagement with Apache helicopters, enemy emplacing a IED. We used some surveillance assets to confirm, positive identification and beyond a shadow of a doubt what the activity was.
Yeah.
Got Apache helicopters in the air and interdicted the IED emplacement with several 30 millimeter gun runs, maybe 12 or 15 gun runs on a group of 10 or 11 people. And the effect of those rounds is absolutely devastating. It's unbelievable. There's, for lack of a better description, without getting too gory, there's not much left. And in this particular instance, someone survived, which is unbelievable to me. Having, I controlled the aircraft and had a real-time feed of the engagement, and someone, magically ended up behind a well next to a mud wall and made it out alive, but barely. And so when the element arrived on the ground to do the battle damage assessment to see if there were any living casualties or, anything of that nature, they found this guy. And so, immediately called in an urgent medevac, just as if this was a wounded U.S. soldier. A U.S. aircraft came to the site. They didn't even transport him back to the Ford operating base for, that's a much safer way of picking someone up. But his urgency was so severe that the U.S. helicopter landed on the road where the enemy was previously emplacing the IED to pick up the enemy insurgent and take him to a hospital. And that person was so combative throughout that whole process that he actually flew in. We sent 2 soldiers to escort him, which is pretty standard. Mm-hmm. He flew in the helicopter with people working on him, and then one of the soldiers escorting him had a knife to his throat for the entire flight. So he was so combative on the flight while receiving the care that was going to save his life, and did save his life, that he actually had to be threatened with his life to save his life, which is an interesting situation to find yourself in.
It is, and it was an interesting situation that we would have. Like, we had a detachment of MPs attached to the hospital for that specific purpose. So like your guys would have flown him in, dropped him off at my hospital, and then they would have gone back. The MPs would have taken over from
Yep.
there. But there were situations where the MP would say like, I can't leave this guy. And I was like, I've chemically paralyzed him. He can't go anywhere. But yeah, I mean, we had folks fight us like on more than one occasion. And the MPs would end up restraining them. But yeah, that's a crazy story. I can only imagine what that flight would have looked like from the med crew standpoint too. Like the dust off guys that came and got him. Like one of the guys that I'm good friends with was a dust off medic up in Mosul in 2006, I believe.
So just to clarify for someone listening, dust off is the universal call sign for medevac helicopters. So medical evacuation in combat is almost always conducted by vehicle or by helicopter. And if it's conducted by vehicle, that's generally to a place where a helicopter can pick the casualty up. And those aircraft, almost universally in my experience, have a call sign of dust off with some number designator afterwards, and that's the flight crew with the medical personnel on it that comes to pick up the injured person. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he told me all kinds of stories about just stuff like that, and having to kneel on a guy's throat, and some guy tried to reach for his 9mm, his handgun, like mid-flight, and the crew chief caught him, and like just craziness. I mean, those guys. You're saying they landed on the road where the enemy was just emplacing IEDs. That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, those guys they're
bold. That's for sure.
They're bold. They're extremely bold, and they will do absolutely anything and go into situations that don't make any sense why you would accept that risk. And usually for U.S. soldiers, but like you said, they were doing this for an insurgent because a patient is a patient. At that point, once you're not trying to kill me, you are just like anybody else. We're going to treat you exactly the same.
So what does a day at work for a deployed nurse? Yeah, were you at Bagram for that first deployment, or
Baghdad?
Baghdad. Excuse me, Iraq for this first deployment.
Yeah, I was at Baghdad at a hospital called Ibn Sina. Was the name of the hospital that we were at, and it was interesting because it was actually what I was told is it was Saddam Hussein's private hospital, so it was an actual hospital. It had ORs and not a nice hospital, but it was a hospital. But it was interesting because the ER that I worked in had marble floors. The whole place was basically made of marble, and it was very ornate, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
I doubt you'll see that again in your career.
No, I'll never see a marble floor ever again in my career. But it made for an interesting kind of dynamic with like the blood on the marble, and it would get slippery, and it was just kind of, they actually roughed it up at one point just to give it some traction. So a day looks a lot like any day for a civilian trauma nurse in the States, except for the casualties or the patients that you see are almost all extremely sick. There's not a lot of places in the U.S. that have a dedicated trauma center. Places like shock trauma here in Baltimore, Miami's got one, Ryder Trauma Center, where actually the Army sends their people. But those places aren't like a standard emergency room. One of your previous guests was a medic there in Greenville, and there's no real designation difference between where he's going to take the car accident patient and the heart attack patient. They're both going to the emergency room. The same doctors are going to take care of them. A lot of times the trauma stuff is taken care of by surgeons, but the ER docs will call the surgeons. Places like here at Shock Trauma here in Baltimore, where I live now, it's a completely separate building. It's a completely separate unit that does nothing but trauma. But we would go in and get report just like any other unit and turn over care from whoever was there. But There were times the patients never showed up one at a time. It was always four at a time. So, and it was always extremely traumatic patients. And then there were times that it was 40 at a time. Um, but it looked a lot like, it looks a lot like what we do in the States,
Just only
in,
trauma,
just all
usually
trauma.
severe.
Well, all trauma, but also we do our fair share of other stuff. Like we treated a lot of Iraqis or third country nationals with medical problems, or, I mean, by the time I was there, like the theater had kind of become mature, and we had a lot of contractors. I mean, guys that aren't exactly in the greatest shape and doing a lot like heart attacks. And I don't remember treating a lot of strokes, but I remember treating a fair amount of heart attacks. And
So you saw a wide spectrum of injuries and conditions, but there was a
yeah,
distinctive trauma leaning that you wouldn't see as much as in the States.
absolutely, absolutely. And it was interesting because it was like living at work. I lived maybe 50 feet, maybe 100 feet from the hospital, pretty much smack on top of the helipad. So I'd hear the helicopters come in and out. And we were on call 24/7, and we worked 3 days on, 1 day off. And the only difference between a day that I was working and a day that I wasn't was I didn't wake up and I didn't show up at 7 in the morning. I showed up at 10 and sat in the
Whenever the
emergency
call
room.
came.
Say that again.
It said you showed up as soon as the call came. They off your schedule is just dictated by calls, basically, right?
Exactly. And I mean, even beyond that, like even if I wasn't being dictated by a call, like that's where my friends were, and that's where my coworkers were, and that's where the TV was. And so we had like a break room that was in the back, and we would hang out there, and the medics would play Guitar Hero or whatever and watch the three AFN channels. And um
Yeah, I think something that's interesting as a point of discussion is generally what time off on a deployment looks like, because most people that see a deployment see a news depiction of a deployment, or
yeah.
they hear a firsthand account from a friend. That's obviously very common. Over 1 million people have served during the global war on terror, and so there's a lot of people out there that talk to their friends about deployments. But I tell you, when I tell deployment stories to my friends, I'm usually digging into the bank of whatever the cool story is, right? Because
Yeah.
most of my friends don't want to hear about soldiers hanging out on bunk beds playing Call of Duty, because
Yeah.
that's not remarkable.
Yeah.
And so
No, but it's so
that
true
time
there.
off is a
And
very strange thing deployed, because there's just not a lot of stuff to do.
there isn't. And we had a fair amount of stuff to do, but it's still just like any other emergency room. I mean, if you talk to any EMT, firefighter, like ER nurse, whatever, there's downtime, particularly for the EMS guys. Like there's a fair amount of downtime, and you sit around till you get a call, and then you go. It's like you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour instantaneously, and that's not that easy for some people to do. Like I've known people that just can't shift gears that rapidly.
And
From
on the
going,
back end too, the come down from that 100 miles an hour back to
yes,
a normal heart rate, that can be that's a process that you have to go through, and
it absolutely is.
getting ramped up and then having to come all the way down from that, and then doing that multiple times a day can be a draining experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, so downtime is what that's probably the things that I remember the most. And I think that was probably, I don't know if it's a defense mechanism or just a coping mechanism, but I deployed with, and I had the advantage of deploying with my now wife, so that helped. Like I wasn't separated from the people I loved as much as other people. Like I wasn't having to leave kids and a wife behind. But I deployed with some of the most amazing people, and these people are some of my best friends still, and will be for the rest of my life. Like we just kind of got a bunch of them together. Probably there were 10 or 12 of us together for the Army 10 miler back in October.
I think that's a
And
story that's told over and over again about groups who've deployed together,
yeah,
and kind of linking back up, keeping the conversation going, keeping up with people. that's common across any societal group. You experience something with a group of people and you create a bond, but I think that bond is cemented through intense experiences.
Yes.
And so, your college friends, that's a type of experience that you go through, and there are challenges and there are victories and failures involved in that. And so you cement relationships through a 4-year or 2-year, whatever experience in college, but also, that same kind of social dynamic happens on a deployment. The experience is just far more intense, and therefore the closeness is I think, cemented more firmly, but also you have these experiences that are, for most situations, a little strange and different from the norm that you now share with that group of people as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we spent so much time decompressing. I mean, we saw such crazy stuff, and I've known people that's stayed with them. And when we had the little reunion back in October, like I remember talking to some of the people, like chief of the ER, a guy named Todd Baker, asked me, "Do you still like remember it? Like, do you think about it all the time?" And I said, at some point, probably during every single day, I think about our experience there, but it's not in a negative way. It's in a very positive way. And I don't think that that's across the board. That's not true for everybody, because they didn't, there's a beauty to death ratio, or a beauty to ugliness ratio that I've heard people talk about. Like you have to keep that ratio appropriate. And for me, like, the way I kept that ratio appropriate was through the relationships that we had and through the people that I was there with, and just sitting and talking and just kind of hanging out with the people that I was there with. And sadly, I'm not sure that everybody had that experience and was able to decompress and let it go. Like, you have to disengage yourself or distance yourself from that being a real person a lot of times, particularly in trauma, or anything, like any just traumatic experience, whether it's sick, somebody gets a horrible pneumonia, or like has a bad stroke, or has a horrible heart attack, or they got in a car accident, or they got blown up by an IED, or they got shot by a sniper. Like, you have to, in the moment, you have to like divorce yourself from it being like a person.
You can't think about the fact that person might have kids.
Exactly.
While you're working on them.
Absolutely not. Like, and I only did it a couple times, and it was, we had a very specific morgue for U.S. soldiers that had passed away, and we would bring their unit in. I went with platoons of guys who had lost somebody within their platoon, and I only did it twice during an entire 15-month deployment. And I forced myself to do it both times because I didn't want to lose touch with the fact that it was a human person, but I couldn't do it every time, or it would have destroyed me. It would have eaten me up. And I made a very concerted effort to make the decision to do it a couple times for that reason. But I knew I couldn't do it all the time because I knew it was going to eat me up.
And these were soldiers visiting the body of a recently fallen member of their platoon before it's sent back to the family.
Exactly. Yeah. And it was an interesting phenomena, particularly when we would get guys via ground. Like, their buddies would essentially be close enough to us that they would just drive him to us. So your buddy gets hurt and you throw him in your Humvee and you drive to the hospital. Just like if something were to happen, like in the States, like your buddy gets hurt, you call 911 and like they're not there fast enough, or how close you are to the hospital. You're just going to throw them in the car and you're going to drive to the front of the ED and you're going to beep your horn and yell and you're going to pull the guy out. I need some help. I need some help. Basically the exact same thing. And I remember very specifically, and it's something I'll never forget, two guys running up to, and we knew they were coming because there was a back gate. It was interesting. We shared our compound with the Australian embassy. And so there were Australian guys on the back gate, and one of them, their job was to just sit there with a automatic weapon pointed at the gate in case somebody decided to charge it. So we had radio contact with them, and they would say that there were U.S. soldiers coming through the back gate. And I looked out, and soldiers were running around. They had grabbed litters and they were throwing a guy on a litter, and they threw him on and they ran. They were running him into the hospital, and it was almost as if they could get him to the hospital, he was going to be okay. It was like home base. If we could just get him to the ED, everything to Baghdad ER, it was going to be okay. They would make it better. And the guy was well gone. Whatever had happened, he had died probably almost instantaneously. He had expired by the time he had gotten to us. But
they had hope.
Making the decision, like, I'm going to take him in and we're going to go to a room and I'm going to tell these guys that they did the right thing. Because their belief was if they could get them to us, it was all going to be okay. And that happened over and over and over, particularly for the guys who would get driven in by their buddies. A lot of our patients got brought in by Black Hawk. And so their buddies turned them over to a flight crew somewhere in Iraq. So we didn't have the interaction with somebody who had a personal connection to that patient. But when they would drive them in, like that was something that was unique and that I had to get used to. And I always made a point of telling them that they had done a good job and that they had done the right thing.
Well, you want them to continue to think if we can just get them to the ER as fast as possible.
Yep. Yeah.
Then that something might be okay. They have to continue to think that. They can't lose hope.
Who was? I think it was our intelligence NCO. I remember him coming down one time, and they had us targeted for indirect fire, and the hospital took a lot of indirect fire. In fact, they blew up a CT scanner one time that was right outside the ED, and the intelligence NCO came down and he said the reason that they have us targeted is it's a if you can take out the hospital, then the guys out there like fighting, they have nowhere to take their patient. That you blew up home base, like you blew up that safe spot. Like you're saying, like you need them to continue to be able to go out there and fight because they know that somebody's back there to make it better. Somebody's back in the rear to fix them if they get hurt. And if they don't believe that, then they're going to be less likely to fight as hard.
Yeah, so this is an interesting concept that is, I think, a major factor in people struggling when they get back from deployments and when they get out. So that it takes me a little bit to get to kind of make that logic leap. But when you're deployed, so from the perspective of the main effort, an infantryman on the ground out there trying to go get the bad guys, right? That's kind of the perceived front line or the main effort is the guy on the ground with a gun trying to go get the bad guys.
Yeah.
So for those guys, their perspective is that they have a job to do, but that everyone is there to support them, right? The level of support and help and input is pretty unbelievable because the standard infantry platoon has intelligence assets that are informing them about the enemy, about the local population, and about other units that are out on the battlefield. So they have this great intelligence picture. And then these infantrymen have trucks that they obviously spend some time maintaining, but there are also mechanics that help them with that stuff. That varies location to location and unit to unit, how much help a unit might get from mechanics, but they have help, right, and support, and somebody's ordering parts for them. And so that's good. And then, when a weapon breaks, if it breaks bad, you send it out to a higher level of maintenance and a new weapon comes back. Fixed and ready to go. And then when you're out on the battlefield and you're in a firefight and you call for help, it's not that help shows up, it's that the most unbelievable aircraft and technologically capable assets come into play that immediately make you 1,000,000 times more advanced and more capable than the person you're fighting. It's like infantrymen, they go out onto the battlefield with all the cheat codes. And that's by design. That's the way our military is designed with regard to capability, and it's for the purpose of winning wars and defeating the enemy. But a person that's used to that kind of support and that kind of backing, it's a very uncomfortable position to go to a place where you don't have it anymore. and it's so necessary for morale and for effectiveness while deployed, because what they face is a very daunting task.
It is, and it's. I thought about that on a very regular basis. I thought about people like you and other guys that I knew that were infantry folks. My job was to be there for you. Like, I had no other job. You're either there supporting the guy that's doing the fighting, or you're the guy doing the fighting. Like, to me, there was always a very distinct line. And I remember hearing somebody say that about the Air Force. You're either a pilot or you're a guy supporting the pilots in the Air Force. Like, there's a very distinct line there. And yeah, that's a very unique thing. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at why a lot of guys have a hard time coming back, because you live in this fantasy world would be the best, like, one way to describe it. Like, it's Groundhog Day every day, and you don't have bills, and you don't have kids to deal with, and you have stress, but it's not life stress. It's not like everyday life stress.
There's a nice buffer built in away from that life stress. Even if you have a family at home and you have bills at home, there's still a significant buffer. There's a significant gap between you and all of those issues.
Yeah, you're not dealing directly with it. And it's easy to lose track of that, or it's easy to ignore it, I guess, is a kind of a crappy way to put that. But it's easy not to have to engage that directly, because you've got everything else going on. And like you said, there's a buffer. There's thousands of miles and time zones and just distance between you and the life stresses that you might have back home. So then you go home and you're like hit with that, and you're like, why am I having to deal? Like, you've lost the ability to deal with that. And you're like, these things are so dumb. Like,
so inconsequential by comparison. Exactly.
And I'll be honest with you, I didn't have I wouldn't say I had struggle coming home, because that doesn't even, like, I had nothing compared to some of the guys that deal with the post-traumatic stress and all of the other stuff that folks deal with coming home. But some of my struggle was just like, this is what you're going to choose to take your time dealing with, and this is what you're going to try and tell me is important. Like, this is so dumb. And
it's almost an unfortunate perspective, you know?
It is like, you don't even know, like, you don't even know, you've never left your little town, and your world consists of these, like, stupid things. It consists of reality TV and, like, social media and, like, the things that people care about. And you come back and you're like, this is so inconsequential. Like, my buddies are still over there. And for me, like, I would have stayed, like, and I was on a long deployment. I was on a 15-month deployment. Like, I would have stayed for years. And I wouldn't say that now, because I have a 2-year-old and, like, things are more complicated. But back then, like, I would have just kept going, because I felt so useful and such a sense of purpose, I guess. I've spent my career since I got back, trying to find that sense of purpose again. And I have. It's just not quite the same.
And I don't think it's ever going to be the same either. You know,
No.
So many people that I've spoken to, and my own feelings included, is you're never going to find the exact experience of that first deployment again, because so much of what's happening is new, and you're learning how to deal with it, and you're seeing success in a particular area for the first time, maybe, and the level of intensity is, it is what it is depending on where you are, but it's not gonna get replicated again. So it's one of those things where you have to, after the fact, deal with the situation being different, and in some cases maybe not ideal, and then find what the next step in being fulfilled and feeling like you're making a contribution is, as opposed to trying to replicate your last step.
Yes. Yeah, and that's an amazing way to put that. Like, it's just, you have to find what your new purpose is, and I think that's hard, particularly, and I think it's really hard for infantrymen and like tankers and anybody that's got that their job in the military has no civilian like equivalent.
It leaves the question much more open-ended for sure.
Yeah. Versus like I knew when I got out, I knew what my job was going to be. It was the same job I was doing in the military to a point. It was a similar job, I guess would be the best way to put that. And the military, I think, is trying to do a better job, but I'm not sure that they do a real great job helping people transition.
I think I could
Particularly when they
do
get out.
I think I could do a year of shows on that transition process and experiences through that transition out. And I think it's important to highlight that some people make both of these transitions at the same time, the transition back from a deployment and the transition out of the military. Those two transitions for many people happen inside of a 6-month window.
Yeah.
And to deal with both of, to deal with the transition out of the military before you've kind of accepted the new environment of coming back home and how your job is different and maybe not as fulfilling. And, and then you get out of the military and it doubles down on that. Your job is even more different and maybe not even close to what you thought it would be as a civilian. Whatever that situation is, some people go through those transitions very quickly once after the other.
Yeah.
But so let's change gears a little bit. You did mention that you deployed with your now wife.
Yeah, I was deployed with my now wife, which is
that happens, and there are regulations associated with married couples deploying. There are regulations associated with couples that are in a relationship but not married and deployed and in the same unit. So how does that actually shake out for you?
So we met about 6 months before we deployed, and we didn't. The kind of train up and spin up to a deployment. You go and do a bunch of stuff, and one of the courses that both of us fought for was a flight nursing course. So Fort Rucker, Alabama, which is in southern Alabama, down in beautiful Dothan. Is where we met at a 2-week-long flight nursing course because we both knew that's what we were going to be doing, or a component of what we were going to be doing, because the hospital that we both worked at did not have neurosurgery capabilities. So anybody that needed neurosurgery then had to be emergently evacuated out of our hospital to Balad, which is where the Air Force had a big hospital, and that's where they had put the neurosurgery capabilities for the country. So we went down there and we just met kind of out of the blue at that course about 6 months before deployment, and just kind of developed a relationship from there. And so we both knew we were going to be going with 86 Cash. And what's interesting,
and a Cash, explain
is
that
a
acronym.
Combat Support Hospital.
Okay.
And what's interesting about the medical side of the military is, when I talked about, like, early in my career, I worked on a medicine floor at a hospital, just like a civilian hospital. In fact, a lot of the people we were taking care of were retirees or dependents. Like, it was a lot of civilians. So you work in a regular hospital, but these combat support hospitals are co-located at places like Campbell and Bragg and Benning and like the troop centers. They're part of the
basically the posts where large combatant commands
yes.
are, the infantry brigades and divisions
exactly.
where there's lots of soldiers.
Exactly. And they don't put all 300 or 500 or however many people were in the combat support hospital. They're not there all the time. They're spread out across the world at different military treatment facilities. So it's what's called Profists. It's a professional filler system. I forget what Profist stands for exactly, but they'll take 2 nurses from this hospital and a doctor from this hospital and a couple nurses from this hospital, and so we all came in from all over the world.
It's a nice, fancy, professional way of saying they hodgepodge the teams together and send them off to do the country's work.
Exactly, and we're all doing the job that we were kind of doing, and we got training for it. But we met 30 days before we deployed together. So we hit the ground in Baghdad on the 1st of November, and I showed up to Fort Campbell to the 86 Cache on the 1st of October. And so we had about 3 weeks of training at Campbell. Went to the range, did certain things like that, and then got on a plane and went to Kuwait. We spent a week in Kuwait, and then we got pushed forward to Iraq. So Anne was stationed in Hawaii. My wife was stationed in Hawaii, and I was in El Paso. And so we kind of had a long distance relationship thing after the flight nursing course. And I think we had actually only been together, like physically together, maybe 3 or 4 weeks before we were stuck with each other 24/7, 365 days a year for 15 months. So I remember having a conversation with her, us having a conversation that we would either do the deployment and come back and hate each other, or we would come back and get married. Like those were basically the two extremes and the two options at that point.
Because it was going to be physical contact was going to be at one of those extremes as well, with it every single day, working in the same place.
Well, and that was the interesting thing is we went into the deployment thinking I was going to be working in the intensive care unit. I was going to be working in a different unit. She knew she was going to work in the emergency room, and I thought I was going to be working in the intensive care unit. So it wasn't going to be face-to-face working next to each other every day. I showed up to Fort Campbell on October 1st, and there was probably like a private sitting there checking off names as we were like reporting, and they told us what unit we were going to be in, and they said emergency room to me, and I looked at it and I said I thought I was going to be in the ICU, and the private looks at me like sassy and says, "Sir, the thing says emergency room." And I said okay. So we were literally working side by side almost every day for about a year, because for the first 3 months we were on opposite shifts. I think I was working nights and she was working days, or vice versa, I forget. But then just the way the rotation worked, we pretty much worked the same shift for the next year. So we worked side by side for a year, and it was an interesting. We have a very interesting. We still work very closely together. In my civilian job now, I'm a flight nurse, and the unit she works in accepts about 75% of the patients we fly into the hospital. So I turn a lot of my patients directly over to my wife. So we still work very closely even now.
I would imagine that may be an integral part of your relationship forever, because you got the relationship trial by fire that nobody else gets.
Exactly. And I said something to somebody the other day whose husband's like a school teacher, one of the flight nurses I work with. And I said, "What do you guys talk about?" And she's like, "What do you mean? What do we talk about?" I said, "When I go home, Anna and I talk about patients, and we talk about management of stuff, and we talk about what we did at work, and we talk about all this stuff." And she's like, "We talk about the same stuff. He just doesn't understand it to the same level. He understands what makes me excited, but he doesn't understand the exact details." Versus my wife and I, she tells me I did something wrong at work, and I'm like, "Why didn't you do this?" Like, and it's not so much you didn't do it right, but you could have done this or you could have done that. And she's 100 times smarter than me, and also has much more training than I do, because she's a nurse practitioner. So she has a master's degree in nursing essentially and management. So she understands some of the concepts more intimately and at a longer level, because she's in the hospital. I understand the immediate stuff, and she understands kind of beyond that. But our relationship is very much solidified by that. And it was kind of interesting because, like you said, there's regulations that, like, if we had been married, we would not have been able to work in the same unit together. Because there were a couple married couples that were there, and one of them was 2 married nurses, and the one nurse ended up in the ICU because there's regulations that say you can't do that. Like, you can't work in the same unit together. I mean, civilian hospitals have the same thing. I could never go work on the unit where she works in the hospital.
And there's multiple reasons for that, but one of the primary reasons is that it creates serious conflicts when it comes to basic administrative effectiveness ratings. And, a supervisor supervising a husband and a wife is going to have a leadership challenge they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yes.
And so there's practical reasons for that other than just, a husband not being able to work with their wife, or the theory that might be the case.
Sure.
But yeah, there's also some efficiencies that you get if deployed in the same place and married versus not, that I'm sure you guys did not see.
Yeah, no, we didn't get to. I mean, the married couples got to live together and things like that. That we didn't get that, and but it was interesting. Like we still have this very unique relationship when we're at work. It was funny. One of the techs that works on the unit that my wife works on now, I had flown a couple patients into her, like over the course of a month or so. This tech had seen like our interactions. And but we don't, I guess we don't act super married, if you will, when we're working, because it's work, like it's professional.
Well, you got the crash course in maintaining the level of professionalism that you need to,
yes,
by working side by side in a serious trauma situation hundreds and hundreds of times for a year on that deployment. So I think you got the graduate level degree in how to work with your spouse and maintain professionalism. Yeah, no,
I would totally agree with you, but it was so funny because like you can still pick up on that if you're paying attention that we like each other. And the tech says, like,
I would hope so.
I think he likes you. And she just looks at this tech and she says, "We're married." And the tech was like, "I would have never, like, I wouldn't have, like, you guys don't act like a married couple when you're at work, but you can still pick up on, like," so it's just kind of interesting. But
I think
we've
that's
always
a good
had that
thing,
relationship. Though. It's a great thing. I love that. I love our relationship, our work relationship. And it's funny. Like I tell her all the time, like, I love watching her work because and that's not something that it's not something that I do very well. Like I have a hard time trusting the people that I work with implicitly because they have to prove to me that they are good at it. And I was worried about that because I had kind of, I can be very demanding, might be the wrong word for it, but I'm very
exacting when it comes to standards. Yeah,
exactly. I hold people to the same standard that I hold myself to, which is kind of hard to do because you can't hold somebody to the same standard that you hold yourself to. But I expect a very high level of performance, and my wife far surpasses that. So she's typically telling me I'm doing it wrong. So
that's a good thing. It is. That I think that would be a legitimate concern. Is you have high standards in a technical field, and the person that you're dating or engaged to or married to is in that same field. There's a serious concern about what if they suck at this. And how am I going to deal with that? And how's our relationship going to survive if I'm good at this and my spouse sucks at this?
That's so true.
It's a real concern.
Hey, she actually just walked up here. Can I add her into this?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is my wife, Ann.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How about yourself?
Good. Thanks for joining us. We were actually talking about your relationship when you walked in. And how that was cemented through the trial by fire of working side by side on a deployment in a high intensity kind of environment.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique way to start a relationship. Yeah.
So we can backtrack a little bit and get the quick story on kind of where you came from and that landed you in the Army.
Yeah, so I knew I definitely wanted to go through nursing, but had my eye on a private college that's tuition was pretty expensive, and I really wanted to pay for my own college. I thought that was pretty important, and so was looking at different scholarships. I had some scholarships for lacrosse and sports, but not quite enough that made me comfortable enough to to sign into the private college tuition rates. So an ROTC recruiter talked to me during one of my visits to nursing school, and I really didn't know anything about it. My grandparents were involved with the military, but nothing closer than that. But the more I heard about it, it was something I would be super interested in. I really thought it would be a great way to apply nursing to something bigger. And I loved the opportunities that I thought that it would provide me. So yeah, I signed a ROTC nursing scholarship shortly after my arrival to college, which happened to be about a week after 9/11.
Well, that's a particularly poignant time to commit to service.
Yeah. So it was a unique time for, I think, all of us to kind of be signing contracts, and there's always the potential for that to be there, but to know that it was definitely there.
Yeah, there's now about a generation and a half of people who signed up knowing exactly the probability of their going to war. And at that time, I started college in 2002. I think a lot of my peer group is right around that time frame, and for so many people during that time, it was a 100% guarantee of a deployment.
Yeah.
No matter a mission specialty, everybody was going because there was so much to be done. But
right.
So on this first deployment together, for lack of a better description, what was it like figuring out your relationship in that department? Because it's not like you had a very mature relationship as a couple. We've talked before you joined us a little bit about what the day-to-day was like, and the heavy trauma, or the heavy percentage of patients with trauma injuries as compared to a civilian environment, and that's an incredibly intense situation. What's it like kind of developing a relationship in that environment?
Yeah, I think it definitely posed its own challenges at times. Instead of just processing those stressors by yourself, you're now bringing a new relationship into it. So I can distinctly remember times that we both kind of needed to step away from each other and process things a little bit separately before we could, I guess, handle them as a couple. So I think we were just super respectful of each other and how each one of us needed to process that stress and the trauma that we were seeing on a daily basis. But ultimately, we were super supportive of each other, and that added a level that a bunch of people didn't have there. That was very unique, and I think we both found extremely helpful.
Yeah, that's the other side of that is, there's the challenge of developing the relationship and just having something else going on in your personal life through all of that. But that can also be an extremely valuable distraction. It can be an extremely valuable kind of source of therapy almost as well for both of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it could have gone horribly wrong. Like, I think that it could have been.
Well, if you weren't the right people for each other, then at some point it was going to take a turn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that it could have actually added more stress to the whole situation. Like, you've got the stress of dealing with the high stress situation, and then you're having to deal with this like new relationship that's causing you stress, and it could have compounded it. And I think we were, I don't know, luckier. We were the right people for each other, so it actually made it better. So it worked out.
You were definitely going to find out right people for each other or not faster than the average couple.
I think, and so initially when we were heading over, I think up until we were in Kuwait, before we actually were in country, Sam was slated to go to the intensive care unit. And
no, that happened day one. That happened the day we showed up to Campbell. Yeah.
So originally we were supposed to be in separate units in the hospital, and then they came and said, oh, by the way, you guys are going to be together. And I think we both kind of looked at each other and we're like, oh God, this is either we're coming back and are going to get married or we are going to hate each other.
It's funny that before you joined the call, Sam's description of we're either going to finish this deployment and get married or we're going to be done forever.
Yep.
The exact same description. And I think that that's absolutely accurate. There's no way that two people survive an incredibly intense experience like that in a relationship, sharing that experience, and they either survive very high on the positive end or very low on the negative end. I think you're not leaving a lot of room for a lukewarm situation at the end there.
So true. Yeah.
So now, and that relationship and your professional relationship is continued straight through to today, correct?
Yeah, it really has. And I'm super thankful for that. We are able to really work well together, and it is now changed into our relationship at work in a civilian setting.
So did you both get out of the Army pretty quickly after that deployment, or what did that look like for both of you?
It was about a year and a half after we got home.
Yeah, about a year and a half, 2 years after we got home. Mm-hmm.
And so you had time to go back, move to, you said Lewis together?
Correct. Yeah. I had some additional training that was in San Antonio I was in Hawaii and then San Antonio that we were separated for. And then headed to Lewis, where I joined Sam.
Okay. And so and then you got married at Fort Lewis or prior to that?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then, once you're married and in the Army's got some provisions for making sure you, or at least trying to make sure you stay together and end up at the same base and do things professionally that work for a family where both are in the military. But that was your first chance to actually see some of those efficiencies in your...
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually, those actually never really affected us because we didn't make a move and we didn't do anything kind of after we were married.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting because you basically get a blank check when you're deployed within the nurse corps. Like, what do you want to go do next? And they kind of give you credit for having deployed and they let you, within reason, say what you want to do next. You don't have to kind of jump through the hoops that you would normally jump through to get to different schools and get assignments that you want. So we both just kind of requested Lewis, which wasn't like we were both requesting to go somewhere just like back to Hawaii or
to Italy or crazy things like that. You were asking for something that was Italy, feasible for the Army to give you.
But yeah, so we both kind of just requested that separately, and I think they knew, like, the nurse corps is pretty small, and we weren't secretive about our relationship by any stretch of the imagination. Like, everybody pretty much knew. And I think they kind of, at that point, as we were kind of making plans for when we would come home, I think they kind of had realized that it was going to work out.
Yep.
So I think there were some phone calls made by some people like, hey, make this happen. Like, this is, give them the married accommodations that you're talking about, like station them the same place.
And it's it's in the Army's best interest to do that kind of thing. They've got two people who are successful at their jobs and they're functional and they're value added, and having people like that live in the situation they want to be living in is good for the Army.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And so, from there you went back to what is, a more typical nurse job in the military stateside, so this is something that there are two different kinds of jobs in the military distinctly. There are jobs that have a stateside mission and jobs that do not. Mm-hmm. And so to describe a little bit about what that means, especially for someone listening who has no military experience, I was an infantryman, and the infantryman is the perfect example of a job that does not have a stateside mission. So everything that infantrymen do in training when they're not deployed, when they're not in a combat situation, is preparing for a combat situation, and that's informed by what's going on in the world, what kind of conflict you're preparing for, but it's 100% focused on getting ready to fight the enemy. Whereas there are a few jobs in the military that have a stateside mission, which creates a complication, and those are basically anything in the medical field. So medical, dental, any kind of care along those lines. And then military police also have a stateside mission as well as a deployed mission. And then some intelligence units have a stateside mission as well as a deployed mission. But then the rest are kind of scattered piecemeal throughout the military. But that dynamic makes an interesting kind of week-to-week, month-to-month schedule, because you're balancing what you have to do at work every day with readiness as well. So there's all of the, who's deployable and who's not, and who's, up to speed. There's all of those trackers in the military medical community, and, who's deploying and when, and how do you manage those personnel issues that civilian units don't quite see as much, I guess. Civilian medical facilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about working in a military medical facility, a military treatment facility, is like there's a ton of civilians. The thing is staffed by civilians. There's all these GS civilians, Army civilians, nurses that work there. And so we kind of come and go and they stay. So they're this like core group at these facilities, and we kind of fill the holes because we're coming and going. And because, like you said, we're balancing, I can only work a shift this week because I have to go to the range, or I have to go over here and do this, or I have to go to some EO briefing, or like things like that. And you're right. It's a unique dynamic, but on top of that, like they try and let you do the job because it keeps you. For you as an infantryman, you go out and you go do maneuvers and you train.
Everything's focused on proficiency. Yeah.
Yeah. And for us, our proficiency is taking care of people. And so they want you to be on shift, and they want you to do the job that you're going to be doing. And so my job was my training. Like going to work for me was just like going to do training. Because if they pull you away from it to do too much non-medical stuff, you lose your edge and you lose your proficiency. So it's a very fine line, because they want you to go to do Army stuff and military deployment skills and things like that. But they also need you to maintain your medical skills and your skills as a critical care provider.
So what does work look like now as a flight nurse for you, Sam?
So I work 24-hour shifts, and 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, and then I'm off for 5 days, which sounds awesome. And it is for the most part, except for when I'm up for 30 hours straight. And there's a lot of training that happens on those 5 days in between. There's just constant.
100% of administrative tasks happen during those 5 days.
Yeah. Exactly. 100% of the administrative tasks. But even beyond that, like just the different cards and skills and continuing education that you have to keep up to date, education days and cadaver labs and all kinds of stuff that we would do in those 5 days in between. So it was pretty rare to have that full 5 days off. But it's a great job. I love it. It's essentially as close as I could get to doing what I was doing when I was deployed. It was the sickest of the sick all the time. And that was the interesting thing about being deployed, is unlike a stateside emergency room where unfortunately our health system isn't exactly perfect. It's far from perfect. There's a lot of people who don't have a primary care doctor, and they use emergency rooms for primary care or for things that aren't appropriate to an emergency room. We turned all of that away when we were deployed. We only saw sick people. Like we only saw people who needed to be seen right now. And that's what flying was for me. It was seeing only the sick people all the time. And it sounds weird, but I'm my happiest professionally when the patient is actively trying to die on me. I thrive on the high acuity, super sick patient that I can make a difference with. I'm not the kind of nurse who takes care of somebody long term, and tells them that they need to take their diabetes medication and their high blood pressure medication, and like there's somebody else that does that, and thank God for them, because I'm not good at that stuff. So for me, that's what flying was. It was go to work and you check your equipment, and then, like we talked about earlier, you sit and you wait, and you get a call, and then you go and you fly to, here in Maryland, it's a little bit unique. We don't do the 911 side of the road like car crashes. It's all inter-facility. So it's all from small hospital back to University of Maryland to the big hospital. So for specialty care or specialty surgeries or advanced diagnostics, things like that.
And in some cases, those patients are, the reason why they're being moved to a higher level of care is because the current facility they're at is struggling to keep them alive.
100%. I joke sometimes that the outlying facility will keep a patient and try and actively kill them until right before they're dead, and then they call us and say, okay, now you can move them. Like, sometimes I joke that they actually would do things to make my job more difficult, which half the time I actually liked, because the sicker they are, the happier I am.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about that a little bit, because it's a very specific mentality that many, even in the medical field, might not fully understand. But coming from the background of an infantryman, I totally get it. And it's the idea that the most intense situation also offers the most satisfying possibility of victory.
Yes.
Right? So if you save the sickest patient, that's significantly better than giving someone who has a sinus issues Benadryl. Like, the victory feels better.
Yes.
And that's
and it's more entertaining is the wrong word, but it's more challenging and it's more engaging, and it challenges you to bring your entire skill set to the table.
And when you put everything you have on the table in an effort and are then successful, the result of that is a significantly different feeling of professional satisfaction.
Yeah, it's rewarding, and it's motivating to continue to make you do better. Yeah.
And so what Sam mentioned is that he generally handshakes a patient off to you on a very regular basis.
Yeah, true. Yeah. He has been known to bring, absolutely, the sickest of the sick, a patient that we think is never going to get to us. We get a call back from Sam, and he's like, we're loading them in the helicopter. Here we come. So yeah, him and the flight crew do an incredible job of getting the patient there. But yeah, I think I would absolutely echo that. I kind of struggled professionally coming back from a deployment in a traditional stateside emergency room department that's filled with coughs and what people in their mind feel potentially is an emergency, but in my mind was not an emergency. I really struggled professionally with that coming back. And while I was deployed, I had such a purpose every morning. There was just no question getting up. It was such a great purpose that I was getting up for, to go potentially help save soldiers. And stateside,
it sure does feel good.
Yeah. And stateside, I was getting up for another shift of somebody with a runny nose. And so, struggled professionally a little bit to get back into that. However, the job that I'm in now and have been for the last 5 years or so, I've really kind of found my stateside equation of what I did in Baghdad is the sickest of the sick and resuscitating those patients.
Yeah, I think you two have both achieved something that in your civilian jobs that is somewhat elusive for many medical professionals coming from the trauma environment of a deployment.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is.
Yep.
And to, specifically, you get bored in the emergency department, and then you hear gunshot wound, you hear someone coming in with multiple gunshot wounds, and oh, by the way, they were also in a car wreck, and just something crazy, and you get a little excited. But the excitement is not at the fact that this person was injured, obviously. If you could prevent people from being injured, you would, because, you entered a profession to make people well. So the sentiment is not that you want the injury. It's that you know those injuries are out there. And if those serious trauma injuries are out there, why wipe runny noses when you can be affecting the most serious, the sickest people that are there? Because those people are going to get shot, and they're going to get in horrible wrecks, or they're going to have horrible illnesses. That happens. Mm-hmm. And for you, it's not excitement about those conditions. It's excitement at the opportunity to have a positive effect on the sickest of the sick.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's I saw a t-shirt one time that said, I don't want you to get hurt. I just want to be there when you do. It's a trauma nursing t-shirt or whatever. It's a trauma nurse. I don't want you to get hurt, but I want to be there when you do.
I think that's a great way to very succinctly wrap up that feeling,
Yeah.
Because you say, oh, I get happy when I hear this, or I get excited when I hear this. That's just because you were given the opportunity to be there when someone needed you most.
Exactly. And you're 100% right. It's not that I want you to get sick, and I want to be there because I want to make you better. I want to fix you. And I feel like sometimes when we're being asked to do some of these things that are lower acuity, somebody else could be doing that. My skill set, my training, the knowledge I have is wasted on that. Put me in front of the sickest patients because I can make that difference. And it's a hard thing to wrap your brain around sometimes.
Well, I think that's a good spot for a wrap up for this phone call. I believe it or not, we've been we've actually been recording for an hour and 20 minutes. So I always look and it feels like, okay, we should be about 15, 20 minutes in. Oh, nope. Hour and a half. But I think there's a lot left that we can talk about with regard to what military medical and that field in general looks like, and how it's a very unique place when it comes to care and treatment of other people. And there's a lot of very, very intense experiences and very permanent bonds made with people in that environment, but there's also an inordinate amount of exposure to trauma and tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But well, thanks very much for joining us, and it's great that you were able to make it on the call as well, so we could get that perspective. You guys have a unique situation, I think.
Yeah. That's to say the least. You're right. Yeah.
And have made, to be frank, what sounds like one of the most smooth transitions from military to civilian, while still being able to kind of maintain a similar professional pace and find a balance of being able to take care of the people you want to take care of, which is, again, congratulations on that. That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, thanks. It was I would say that I got lucky more than anything else. I just lucked into the job opening where it did. But I had a lot of worry when I was getting out as to where I would go and what I would do and what I would find that I loved as much as I loved the military.
Well, it's definitely great that you're in the positions you're in, because it's good to know that people like you are out there helping the sickest of the sick. That's for sure. If I'm one of those people, I'll have the confidence that you're going to come get me.
Sure.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Fear and Courage podcast. If you know anyone who you think would be a great guest for the show, please email me at fearandcouragepodcast@gmail.com. See you next week.